Welcome to Mania and Melancholy. We're doing a Father's Day weekend special episode. I'm really happy to have you here. I wanted to bring you on partly because you're my dad and I wanted to talk to you, but I also wanted to bring you on because I know you are very passionate about public transportation and trains in specific, and it's a topic that I think, especially in people in my generation, they don't even know what trains do. They're not even sure they kind of not exist, but like they don't know this whole world that I know you are a big part of. And I wanted to bring you in to kind of expand upon that world. I mean, an example is, when we've taken the train to go to Utah or somewhere and we've told our friends will often say, I didn't even know you could take the train. I didn't even know this was a thing.
Yeah.
And so tell me on a big level, like, why are trains important if you're talking to someone who doesn't know the role they've played?
Well, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. You've done this for quite a while, and I've listened to a number of your
Can you just grab the and bring it just a little closer?
Yeah,
yes.
I've listened to quite a few of your podcasts and things like that, and I think you've definitely improved over the years. It's been interesting guests, and so. Yeah, a lot of this stuff I obviously think about, and I have friends that are very biased towards this type of thing, and that together we have done a lot of railroading trips and adventures. But yeah, you are correct in that in the United States, the railroad industry in general and passenger trains specifically are really kind of a great unknown. I think most people, even probably of your generation, have at least heard of Amtrak. Mm-hmm. They don't probably know much more than that.
Yeah.
But it's a brand that is kind of recognized in name, but whether they have experienced it is another question. And I think the reason is because it's pretty obscure. We have our national passenger rail system is super skeletal. It's pretty inadequate, and it's also now very, I would say, the equipment is antiquated. A lot of the stuff that Amtrak's running is approaching 50 years old.
What? Really?
Yeah. And they just it's a complex thing. Amtrak has become a political football over the years, and the fundamental problem is the United States, and I say United States, the federal government has not ever made a commitment or provided the leadership, except for one exception most recently, to try to develop a world-class passenger rail system in the United States. And particularly when compared to Europe and compared to Asian countries, the Chinese, since 2000, have built 26,000 miles of high-speed rail, which is trains that basically travel faster than 150 miles an hour.
So that's the definition of high speed.
That I'm going to use that 100 probably there's no real technical definition. Probably greater than 125. Sustained speeds of greater than 125.
Do you mind if I delve into some of the differences there? So as the current Amtrak trains we have in the U.S. now, the passenger trains, what is their kind of top speed?
Okay, so Amtrak is, I would say, it's divided into three. This is not formal, but it's kind of an informal segregation of three subsystems. One is the Northeast Corridor, which is the busiest part of the Amtrak network. It runs from Boston, New York City, Philadelphia to Washington, D.C., And now Virginia is has expanded and has kind of extended it down a little bit more, but that's basically the Northeast Corridor, and that's the busiest part of the Amtrak system, and it is the fastest part. That they have a train called the Acela, and back east there, you sometimes it's referred to as the Acela Corridor. There's a few places where they get to 150 miles an hour.
Oh, really?
But yes, it's very few. It's like 27 miles out of 450 that has a top speed like that.
So that's why it wouldn't be considered high speed, because that is not sustained over longer periods.
Right.
And just to clarify one thing, especially about high speed rail, is something I think my generation may have heard about.
Right.
And it's one thing I even had to clarify with. I remember when I was in high school and Jacob brought it up. A lot of people think high speed rail, like especially in places like you mentioned, Asia and Europe, is that maglev. But most of them, I know those maglev trains exist, but most of these are same, kind of. Can you describe the high speed rail system there?
Sure. No, it's kind of interesting. So high-speed rail got its start in Japan, and I think many people know it as the bullet train.
In the Shinkansen in the 1960s or so.
Right. It was built. The Japanese were awarded the Tokyo Olympics in 1964, and keep in mind, it's post-war Japan. And they had suffered a lot of damages and things from World War II. And so they were anxious to prove to the world that they had rebuilt and they were a modern society and, a world player. And so as part of the Olympic Games, they looked at their rail system, which was pretty extensive, but they realized they didn't have the capacity to handle crowds and things that they needed. So, and this actually, the planning started in the 50s, but with the awarding of the Olympic kind of expedited it, and they built the first bullet train
from Osaka to
from
Tokyo.
Osaka, Kyoto, and to Tokyo. And at the time, it's kind of interesting, the bullet train with the top speed on the train was 120 miles an hour. And they built all new right-of-way, all new track, which is key. But it was still steel wheels on steel rails. And after that, yes.
No. So it's still the same. Just to clarify, steel wheel on steel rails. Right. Is it just higher capacity?
Well, the key thing is it's electrified. Electrification, meaning the trains are powered by overhead wires.
Yeah.
As opposed to like a diesel or a steam engine or things like that, which were the modes that were pulling trains at the time. And there was some electrification, but they developed an electrified system because they realized that per physics, only an electrified motor could provide the power and the speed necessary in order to operate at these high speeds.
And so just to illustrate a bit, it's like a lot of people are very familiar with like a light rail-like system, and that they have above those trains, they have those wires, and that provides, like you said, these trains with enough power consistently to reach those speeds.
Right. And things like you can get really technical. Light rail, like we see here in Denver, it's a 1500 volt DC system. You get, if you ride those trains, you notice how rapid the acceleration is. Now, their top speed is about 55 miles an hour because they're stopping so frequently and things like that. The most major systems are like 25,000 kilovolt AC systems, and they are able to, now you have some that are able to obtain speeds 220, 230 miles an hour. And just to wrap up kind of the Japanese.
So these just to emphasize, they have these steel wheel trains,
right,
that still reach speeds of 230 miles an hour.
Yes, and tests have done better than 250.
No way. I mean, that's insane.
Yeah, I mean, it is pretty amazing, but considering, but it shows you the capability of the steel wheels, steel rails. It is super efficient. That's what makes rail gives rail and its inherent advantage is because there's less friction, there's less, it just physics, it has an incredible advantage.
So with the steel like wheels, there's just less friction. Friction is a very important thing that does hinder a lot of systems from going to so fast. And so really the steel on steel allows less friction to be able to go. I wouldn't think that, you think metal on metal, you don't think that, that would be an ideal system, but it is.
Well, and here, think of this. The point of contact on a steel wheel on rail is probably the size of $50. At any one point in time, the maximum amount of contact on a wheel on a steel rail is just a $50. It's so small. There's not much contact.
Versus like
a rubber tire. Look how much of your tire is touching the pavement.
Oh, I didn't think about that.
Right. And then with electric motors, and people who have electric cars now should recognize this, the tremendous torque, the initial thrust that electric vehicles can generate is amazing. And so, and I know I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but just for example, I want to show you. So just recently, there is a commuter rail line from San Jose, California to San Francisco. It's called the Caltrain. And they last fall just finished electrifying the line. And they got these new trains. They're Swiss trains. Stadler's the builder. They built them in Utah. And they put them in, they created a schedule with these trains that now an express train with electric power with a top speed. Now this shows you how the torque and acceleration, the top speed is only 80 miles an hour. That's all that it's signaled for with stops and things like that. But it's sped up. Previously, these trains were all diesel powered. The previous best time for a diesel powered train was about, I want to say 85 minutes
from these places.
From San Jose up to San Francisco. That's the express train. It made like 4 stops.
Yeah.
With the electrified trains and they ran the wires. They had to build the wires for 47 miles overhead to connect. Now it does that same route on express train in 1 hour. So it cut 20 minutes off of time, but the top speed's still the same.
It's just the acceleration.
The acceleration, and you know what also? A concept called the deceleration. Deceleration, they use what's called dynamic braking and electronic braking, and regenerative braking. That's the word I'm looking for, sorry. And what it does, as it brakes to a stop, it's generating electricity that puts back into the wire. And so they generate electricity by braking, and they use it while accelerating. Now, it's not 1-to-1, but still, nonetheless, these trains are able to accelerate so quickly and decelerate much quicker that they are then able to make 20 minutes of change, which is a significant amount on a journey of 47 miles. So then just take that theory and run it. Let's say you run 150 miles and you're just only stopping at 4 stops on a inner city route, and you're able to get up to 220. You knock the times down phenomenal.
I mean, that's so that is so interesting how little changes in a system can make it more efficient. And I mean, this is I really appreciate. Like, I didn't know that steel wheel analogy with like just little things like that. An advantage that has is something that, I know a lot of people in my generation who may not know about trains but are very passionate about very similar physics type systems that work, engineering type people. And I think that this maybe we'll get in maybe this is a good shift here is to trains in specific really changed the world in the 19th century. I mean, I don't think we appreciate, especially in a place like the American West, where for the first time, I mean, you have to, I try to paint a word picture for people of, you're living in, let's just say the 1800s. If you want to get from one place to another, you either have to walk or get on a horse.
Yeah.
And for the first time, especially in a place like America where the West was just so expansive, it's so big, trains provided this revolutionary way to get around. And so I know we're kind of shifting here, but I wanted to give people, we're talking about all these technical details. What is the history of trains in America? I mean, a overview version, if you had to give your take on how trains helped shape what modern America, especially in the West, became.
Well, I appreciate your question. It's a good question because, to believe it or not, 2025 is generally looked at as the 200th year of the formation of the first railroads, and that was done in the UK, in Britain. And so actually in Britain they're having quite a few celebrations this year, and it was the first sense of a train, and what enabled that to happen was the development of the steam engine. So the engine is being powered by steam, and that then provided the power and the means to which you could pull or more than what a horse or whatever could provide. Because there were cases people had developed had used having horses or donkeys, particularly in mines, pulling carts on ribbons. Usually it was iron back then and things like that, or wood with iron on top, because they realized the same friction thing too. And a horse could pull 4 or 5 mine carts, and it evolved. And then with the development of the steam engine in 1825, they could pull 3 cars.
So that's the year of the first steam engine.
Yeah, and the first railroad, which was recognized, it was a 25-mile railroad up near Scotland in northern Britain, closely associated with the U.S. Then shortly over that thereafter, that technology came to the United States. I mean, it wasn't very long at all, and it was the beginning of, you started to see the first railroads along the East Coast. And yes, up till that time, it was the horse. It was maybe a stagecoach, for passenger accommodations, walking, and then also in the eastern U.S., because of geography and because of there was quite a canal network. They developed canals like the Erie Canal in New York and things like that, and they had developed lock systems to help them go over the mountains. But I mean, you need obviously water, and you need but that enabled more cargo to be carried. I mean, it wasn't real fast, but it enabled you to carry more cargo. So as the railroads developed, they came over here, and you started seeing them on the East Coast going to different places. One of the first railroads in the United States was the Baltimore and Ohio, and it started the process of railroads started taking names on that were named their ambition of where they wanted to go. So
really,
the Baltimore, the intent was the Baltimore and Ohio was to get to the Ohio River Valley. And you see this in all kinds of railroad names in the 1800s.
That's so interesting.
But anyway, if we fast forward, so it started to evolve. Engines got bigger, technology got better, and America had the development of the railroad went along with the manifest destiny culture. We wanted the whole continent, the whole thing, and what really started pushing this, when California was part of the United States in the gold rush of 1849, everything had to be shipped around, either around the, Chile and all that area, or across Panama. They would carry stuff across the Panama Strait there. But, I mean, it was just so arduous to try to get anything there. So they realized, the idea of building a railroad people started talking about it. But what really did it and what got it going was in 1861, Lincoln signed the Pacific Railroad Act. And the Pacific Railroad Act was the government act that decided upon the building of a transcontinental railroad that would be built essentially from Omaha, Nebraska, across Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, what would be Nevada, and then to California. And they would start at two different ends, and they were private companies. One was the Central Pacific, which was in California, and then the Union Pacific, which started out of Omaha. And the way this...
and was this the Transcontinental Railroad?
This was the Transcontinental Railroad. And the way that... The reason that was the government got involved because the project was of such magnitude and such largeness that they knew private industry couldn't fund it all. So the government, instead of providing direct cash grants, developed this concept of land grants. And then they also did bonds, and they would pay railroad companies for the amount of track indirectly. But what land grants were, they would give every other mile in a checkerboard-like pattern. They'd give a square mile to the railroad to have, and then they could sell it to settlers or things like that. It was a way of populating along the route. Well, the Civil War was going on, so the railroad really didn't get started. I mean, there was some miles built in California, but not much. It wasn't until 1865, post-war, then construction started, and the building of the railroad is a whole history in and of itself. There's been novels and books written.
There's been series, because it's kind of almost like there was a lot of different forces involved of private interests.
Oh, yeah, and it's interesting. I think the corruption was just rampant. It was throughout the halls of Congress. There was all kinds of things. There's a great series on American Storytellers podcast.
Yeah, I think I sent that one to you.
Yeah,
yes.
There's a 4 or 5 part series on the Transcontinental Railroad, which is really well done and explains all in detail. But finally, in 1869, and I think most kids in America in their history books have seen that famous picture where the two engines are facing each other and the guy's holding whiskey bottles, and where they met in Promontory, Utah. And at that point, the first Transcontinental Railroad was completed. And it started a railroad building. And we were building railroads before, but this really prompted it.
It connected the continent. I think, like
Right.
you said, this is important. You have to, now we have highway systems and cars, but the reason I brought up like the horses earlier is to emphasize a couple years ago we were stranded out in the desert, and I had to walk to get us out of there. And it made me realize of like, oh my God, I couldn't imagine being out here where you don't have a way to, like, if you want to get somewhere, you have to walk, you have to get on a horse. And during this time, there were, in some parts of the country, there were Comanche, there were violent tribes. Getting across the continent was a big issue. And California already kind of had some settlements. So that connection was very, very important. And to emphasize, you said the trains weren't very fast, but I think another point that should be emphasized is they didn't need to be, because they were consistent. Because the track was laid, as long as they got where they were going, they didn't have to worry about having to stop for something. There was that just the consistency. The fact that you would get there even if you went at 30 miles an hour was so important.
Right.
And it allowed, like you said, cargo and then people. That connection of transportation was so fundamental in a massive continent. This isn't like Europe where people had lived there for thousands of years. There were road networks. This was an untamed continent.
Right. And you're right. The development of the railroad, a couple things. You talk about not having to be fast. A real anecdote. There were stories at the time that they believed that if you got above 15 miles an hour in speed, that your body would just collapse and suck.
You got above 15 miles an hour?
That was the initial fear of people riding train, and you heard stories like that you would collapse and die, or some horrible stories. But the railroad, particularly, it hastened the decline and hastened the demise of particularly the Plains Indian cultures and the native cultures, everything west of the Missouri River and everything was really, once the railroad was built, it really hastened the decline of those, because it brought people here, B, it cut up migratory routes of the great bison herds. It hastened their demise, so that, it didn't take long once the railroad was the Transcontinental, and then others being built as well, quickly brought settlers and things like that, and that was it.
What you said there was the settler. It wasn't the trains. The trains were the vehicle for the demise, because they brought the people who brought the disease, who were killing the
Right.
It was. I loved in Ken Burns' documentary on the bison. The Plains Indian described the steam engine as this big black horse. Like they didn't even know what this thing was.
Right.
Can you imagine you're a nomadic plains tribe and you're out hunting bison?
Yeah.
And you just see this. What do you even think? That has to be like a UFO-like experience.
Yes.
And you don't even know that it's like, you probably are just so curious. You don't even know that, this is the beginning of the end for your people.
Yeah. I think they probably, they had some sense, which is why they fought it. There was a lot of violence, particularly on the Union Pacific across Nebraska and things like that. Track was built and then it was destroyed. It was these kind of the sad consequence. If it's your homeland and this is your lifestyle, you're going to defend it. It's a perfectly understandable thing. How dramatically, how quickly it changed everything within a 10, 11 year period. It totally, the herds were wiped out, everything. It's one of the great near extinction events in the world, particularly the buffalo, that it's just dramatic what an impact it had.
I would again point people, if you ever want, that Ken Burns documentary is really, really, really good about, if you want more for that. Anyway,
once the railroad began, and then other railroads were built. There was the Northern Pacific, the Great Northern, that was across the northern tier, and they took advantage of the land grant systems. One of them did, one of them didn't. Private capital started coming into it because they realized they could make money. But the thing I want people to realize, and this kind of ties into your question about, number one, people aren't aware and things of railroads today, of how important and how critical the railroads were to people of that time, particularly in the western United States. It was just absolutely almost essential that you were on a railroad line, because, again, without the railroads, even into the early 20th century, and I have a couple examples, without the railroad, you still could not get anywhere without a horse or a walk.
Well, and even with a horse, if you're your dad, my grandfather, grew up in Atchee. Even if you have a horse, the West is massive. You have to have that ability to move very, very, not just 30, 40 miles, but hundreds of miles over the course of maybe a couple days, but very consistently.
Yeah, and so, for example, real quickly, is for the city of Denver. So Denver was founded by 1859 because gold was found, Ralston Creek in Arvada area, and which led to other findings throughout Colorado. And So that's 1859. 10 years later, you had the Transcontinental Railroad built. Now, there were different routes surveyed for the Transcontinental line, the initial one. The initial one ended up going across Nebraska and through Wyoming for a very practical reason, that the route through Wyoming does not have near the mountain passes that you have west of Denver. And so Denver at the time, and the merchants and the people realized they were very concerned. They were very concerned
Of being
about
cut off.
of being cut off, and that maybe Cheyenne, because Cheyenne was built on the Union Pacific. It was a Union Pacific town, and it was a significant point. And they realized we need to be on a rail line. So there was a rail.
Really, I didn't know about this. This is so.
So two things happened. While the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, there was another railroad called the Kansas Pacific being built from Kansas City west across Kansas and into eastern Colorado and eventually to Denver. Once it got to Denver, the Denver folks still realized, man, we're still a long ways from major markets. And the city actually, not formally, but the business folks got together and built a railroad called the Denver Pacific, which was built from Denver to Cheyenne to connect Denver to a transcontinental railroad. Because, again, they realized we need to be connected to the rail system, because without it, we will not prosper, we will not grow. It is impossible. The city leaders say, hey, we got to build this railroad. And so the business people got together and built a 100-mile connection up to Cheyenne called the Denver Pacific.
I just want to, because I didn't know this, because one of the things, I think I sent you a video of why is Denver so much more developed now with a bigger population than Wyoming. And this is very interesting that the actions of these people who had this interest knew that. For those of people who don't know, Denver is still to this day the most isolated city in America. There is not a city of similar size for over 1,000 miles. Salt Lake is that, but it's not quite near. It's nowhere near as big as Denver. And it was so interesting that at the time, people in Denver knew that if we didn't have a connection, for those of you who don't know, like if you've ever driven across I-80. It kind of goes through the mountain passes of Wyoming, where the mountain passes are much more hill-like.
Yeah.
They're not these big continental divide, huge mountains, and that leaders of Denver at the time realized we need to be connected if we don't want our city to just become some isolated place where no one ever goes, and how that their efforts of connecting through the Denver Pacific to Cheyenne was kind of that lifeline that kept Denver alive and fueled it today.
Right. And then of course we also, Colorado here specifically, with the gold rush and other mineral discoveries and things like that, it did become a destination. And from that point, Denver did become a basis for many actual railroads that penetrated through the mountains, most of which at the time were what we call narrow gauge railroads. So standard gauge, what we ride trains today, are
and
4 feet. The gauge is the distance between the track, between the two rails. How far is it apart?
Okay.
And so standard gauge, which is what our system is, and most systems of the world, there's variations, but is 4 feet, 8.5 inches. And there's a lot of things, rumors on how that came to be. But anyway, that's the standard. However, in Colorado, what was popular to build, and the reason was narrow gauge. And narrow gauge,
And what
it was 3 feet here in Colorado. Now, there's different narrow gauge widths, but throughout the world. But in the United States, the prominent narrow gauge width was 3 feet between. And the reason, the advantage was you could build it cheaper You could build tighter curves. You could go through them. You didn't have to build as big a tunnels. You didn't have to build as big a bridges and timber trestles. It enabled you to penetrate through parts of the mountain, through the mountains, to get to where you wanted to go, which is basically the gold fields, the mining areas like Leadville, places like Gunnison, Crested Butte, places like Silverton, Colorado. These places, which were Cripple Creek, where a lot of them were served by railroads. In fact, I would say there's almost no place in Colorado, in the mountains where you go today, that were not at one time that did not have a railroad. I mean, that's hard to believe.
Even a place like Creed?
Creed, yes, that was one of the last great gold rushes. And the Rio Grande, that one there was built I believe it was built as standard gauge, because at that time the Rio Grande, which was the railroad built pretty prominently through Colorado, they were widening some of their narrow gauge lines to standard gauge, because the problem is with when you have two different kind of gauges. Okay, you bring the ore or you bring the goods down from the mountains and you get to Denver, and then you got to transfer from from the narrow gauge to the standard gauge, and that takes people. It takes time. Back then, labor was pretty cheap, and you could still do it economically, but nonetheless, it was not as efficient. And also this ties into what even Denver supporters and things like that, despite the building of the connection to Cheyenne, they still were not satisfied. They still dreamed of being on a transcontinental railroad that came through Denver, was a spur from Cheyenne. And again, this brings us back to the fact that we don't realize how important the railroads were to the people of that area and the settlement of the West in particular, and in Colorado in particular. Like I said, there's not hardly a mountain town that didn't have railroads at one point in time.
It's so fascinating, because now Colorado has become a very popular place for, the natural beauty, for a lot of different reasons. And I'm sure if you talk to most people in Summit County, let's just say, they probably may have never even been on a train, and yet that place was Summit County.
Yes, yeah. Believe it or not, there was. There were two railroads. Well, there were small little mining railroads, but there were two lines to Summit County at one time. You had one that came from over. If you go up 285 and you go up through South Park, it came over a pass called Boreas Pass and dropped into Breckenridge and down to Dillon and to Frisco. And then the Rio Grande built a line from Leadville over Fremont Pass and down into Frisco in that area, because that was another gold mining area. So again, it was these narrow gauge railroads that was built.
And just to emphasize, so the narrow gauge, it was more of a logistics issue, and that it allowed you to overcome. You didn't need to build, like you said, as big of tunnels. You didn't need as much, maybe as much material for track, because it was narrower.
Right.
And like you said, in the mountains of Denver, for maybe people who haven't been in these places, those turns, that's a big issue trying to get around. Those very sharp turns, you don't want all your cargo to fall over, and that narrowness probably allows the center of gravity to be a little bit more.
Yeah, and they weren't going very fast, but they could do it more cheaply. It was just, and they could build it quickly. They could build it cheap and quick, and they did it. Now, ultimately, to just kind of wrap this up about how important to Denver it was, in 1903, there was a person named Dave Moffat who...
Is this what the Moffat Tunnel's named after?
He's named after. David Moffat decided to build a railroad west from Denver. It was the first one directly west from Denver. And his ultimate goal was to get to Salt Lake City, and then also maybe the Pacific Northwest. And it was one of those, this is what I mean, it was the Denver Northwestern and Pacific Railroad. railroads used to in those days put what their ambitions were in their name. There was like the Denver South Park and Pacific, and it never made it past Gunnison. But anyway, the Denver Northwestern Pacific started, and they built a standard gauge railroad because at that time people were realizing having these two different gauges, and they built a line west from Denver, and it is the line today that Amtrak and the ski train use to get to Winter Park. Now, when David Moffat built it, he didn't build the Moffat Tunnel. He built a rail line over the pass, over the top, over Rollins Pass, which is now a four-wheel drive Jeep road. And it is, and that the cost of keeping that open was one of the big hindrances, because he only got as far as Craig, Colorado. That's where the railroad ended. And
It's kind of a dismal place to end.
yeah, he didn't get, which is west of Steamboat. He made it to Steamboat and things like that. Well, Denver still dreamed of being on a transcontinental railroad, and they realized this route could get them there. And so in the early 20s, the legislature approved the building of the Moffat Tunnel, and it was a publicly financed project that the railroad paid back. It started in 1923, and it was completed in 1927. And the Moffat Tunnel, which is 6.2 miles long, eliminated the need to go over Rollins Pass, really expedited the the travel time, because now you go through the tunnel and you go through it now, I think 10 minutes, 11 minutes, as opposed to 2.5 hours, 3 hours going over the pass. And in the wintertime, it was god-awful amount of snow. But there was still a 34-mile missing link between a place, and this is pretty obscure, but if people have rafted the Colorado River, a place called Bond, Colorado, and a place called Dot Zero, Colorado. Now, Dot Zero, people might notice it from I-70. It's right before you get to Glenwood Canyon. But there was a 34-mile gap, and once the tunnel was completed in 27, they realized we need to complete that tunnel, because at Dot Zero was where the Rio Grande's main line to Salt Lake went. So if you wanted to go Denver to Salt Lake before the completion of the Dot Zero cutoff, you had to go down to Pueblo, and then you had to go up through Salida and over Tennessee Pass, and then you had to go to Glenwood, Grand Junction, and that way.
That's a long...
Yes, it's 700 and something miles. So anyway, during the Depression, one of the WPA projects was the completion of what they called the Dot Zero cutoff that connected Bond to Dot Zero and put Denver on the transcontinental map. And the reason I point this out and we go into this so much, even in the 1930s, this was still very important for Denver and the people. They realized and how important the railroads were.
That's not even 100 years ago.
No, it was so important. It was that they have this, that they realized, hey, we're on this line now. We'll have access direct through. And so it was, the railroad was a part of everybody's life. The other thing that's important, and I want to mention this too, and we've kind of overlooked, is that at that time, the railroads in the United States, they not only provided freight service, but they also provided passenger service. So they had their own passenger trains and their own freight trains. So if I wanted to go from Denver to Salt Lake, let's say in 1939, I could either take the Rio Grande, which would take me through the mountains to Salt Lake via Grand Junction, or I could take the Union Pacific, which would take me, I could go up to Cheyenne and then across Wyoming and down to Salt Lake. And people knew the railroads, people were aware of the railroads because they knew how important they were, and they knew them by their passenger trains, how they could get places. It was before the big highway systems were developed and things like that. And so it was a prominent part of people's lives. It was how they got around. Now,
So it was like your car is today. How fundamental your car is to Americans today. I mean,
probably pretty significant. You know what I would equate it to? Maybe better. It's a good how airlines are to us today. I know I'm going to Chicago. I can take Southwest, United, Delta. I can take a zillion different ones, but they are really important for me to get there.
But the reason I would say car is because back then, I think when people think of plane, they also think I can drive there too.
Yeah.
But like you couldn't just there's
it'd be more difficult.
Yes, because when did
Well, that was the big thing. So what happened was post-war and during World War II, the railroads were integral to the war effort. They hauled more troop people, and cargo and stuff than probably any time in human history. There was more goods and people moved by the United States railroads back and forth across the country to get things for the war effort. It was just an amazing, phenomenal thing. And post-war, the railroads were feeling pretty good. They'd done real well during the war, and they made massive investments in new passenger trains. And because they felt very optimistic at that time about, hey, this is the economy. The economy, we recovered from the Depression. Things were looking up. The war had provided that huge economic boost. And so they invested in passenger trains. And if you look at many famous movies and things like that, and people may have heard of some of this, some of them have not. I mean, we're getting so far away from it. Trains like the 20th Century Limited, the Super Chief, the Santa Fe Super Chief, Union Pacific Cities trains. And one of them famous is California Zephyr, which ran from Chicago, Denver, Salt Lake, and all the way to essentially San Francisco. But that post-war passenger rail boom quickly diminished. And what happened was the United States made and it wasn't an overall global policy decisions. In the U.S., sometimes I think what happens is we make decisions, this is a good idea, we should do this. And this is a good idea, we should do this, without looking overall what the consequences
so
are.
short-term thinking kind of.
And just looking at the single issue. Obviously, the war expedited the development of aircraft and things like that. It's really took it, and so you had the beginnings of the domestic airline industry, and things really started, growing there. Also, people were back, and the United States, and unlike Europe and even Asia and other countries of the world, Europe made a very conscious decision that post-war, they decided to tax gasoline and fuels at a much higher rate than the United States. The United States we've always kind of had an anti-tax type thought. And so the idea of a U.S. gas tax was no, we don't do that. Europe taxed their fuels, and they took those dollars and started rebuilding their rail systems post-World War II. And they started, so the cost to drive was always significantly higher. Post-war, states were developing highways, things were starting to happen. And then the big impetus came when Eisenhower in 1956 signed the Interstate Highway Bill, which led to the development of the interstate highway system in the United States. And they did raise they had to fight for it. People think it was just a slam dunk. They had to fight for it for a while because they decided to raise the fuel tax a few cents, like 4 or 5 cents, which, I mean, when gas was only 30 cents a gallon or 38 cents a gallon, that was a kind of significant. But the plan was we will develop this system of highways. And what Eisenhower, the reason he was able to get it through was part of it was a defense thing. he says, I can't march an army across the United States. It would take me weeks and months because we don't have a road system to do it. And so it was the federal interstate highway system that was designed for, quote, defense purposes, that also led to, obviously, benefits to all of us being able to take advantage of it. But that program really decimated the passenger rail system in the United States. That and the development of the jet airliner by Boeing at the same time.
And I think also, you kind of mentioned it, but like during this time, automobiles were also getting a lot better and more affordable. People could start to own their own automobile,
right?
Which happened. I think part of the, you said, trains got really good in a short period of time. Well, then I think that just also sped up how good airlines got, how quickly automobiles got. And so you just had more competition in that space. I think I love, we spend the time to answer that question because that I really think beautifully paints
and if I could, I'd like
yes.
to just kind of get to where we are today. So, come the 1960s, the interstate system is well under construction. Cars have taken over as the primary means, which has also led to suburbanization and things like that, made because it was affordable. You could live 10 miles from work and afford to drive to work and stuff like that. But that, and then the development of the jetliner, the jet, sped travel dramatically. And at the time, then the federal government also there was more of a development in airports, publicly provided airports, and things like that. So what you had a private rail industry who was trying to compete with, particularly on the passenger side and on the freight side too. And it's still manifesting itself to this day, but particularly on the passenger side, they were trying to compete with these two other modes, which were heavily subsidized essentially by the government. And so while they didn't subsidize the buying of your car, they built the road that you could drive on. And while you, quote, did pay for it, and we all did pay for it, we still, it was a massive subsidy that the private companies were not getting. And so what was
the private train companies?
Yeah,
were
the
not
private
getting,
railroad companies.
And just kind of this how it went.
Right.
So the roads that you could drive on were being subsidized by the government, by our taxes, in a way that the rail system just wasn't.
And they were paying taxes if they were making money. But anyway, coming to the 60s, many factors, particularly those, but then also on the industrial side, you started seeing the movement of industry out of the United States and things like that because of cheaper overseas manufacturing and things like that. You had a rail industry in this country, particularly in the eastern United States, the northeastern United States, but other areas as well, where you had massive bankruptcies of railroads. And you had issues of where deteriorating railroad track and passenger train, and so they had a loss of freight, and the passenger trains were money losers. Passenger trains, particularly all kinds of passenger trains, have basically, there are cases of some have made money and things like that, but basically they were a drain on the assets of the company, railroad companies, particularly the ones in the Northeast and things like that. So, and there's a lot of other reasons too. Railroads were heavily regulated, but that's another topic we can talk about another day. But here, what you had, railroads were screaming for relief, and there was a genuine concern in the country about what's going to happen. And, there was talk of maybe we need to nationalize the railroads, which in this country, the concept of nationalization is a hard
sell.
It is a super, super duper hard sell. And so anyway, as the number of the railroads were allowed to discontinue passenger trains and discontinue service, and things like that. And there got to be a genuine concern about what will we have? Will there be any viable passenger rail system? There was still an idea, and they say, why should we care? Well, there's a lot of places that aren't served by rail or served by other modes reasonably, that rail can provide capacity and the ability to move people, unlike other modes, because of its inherent efficiencies, environmental benefits, and things like that. So, and also with the bankruptcy of the freight companies, the idea came on that what we should do, and this is the foundation of Amtrak in 1971. Let's take the operation of the passenger trains, away from the freight railroads, and this will become a government, or they sold it as a company. When Amtrak was formed, it's a quasi. It's not really a government agency. It's kind of a funny quasi agency, but it was set up to take over the passenger operations of all these railroads, and then someday it will get efficiencies and this and that, and it'll start making money, which it won't. It can't. But nonetheless, the ironic thing, it was President Richard Nixon, who was a very conservative Republican, very, not wanting to build government bureaucracy and not trying to do this, who assigned the bill that it was called the National Railroad Passenger Corporation, which the acronym for it was Amtrak, was formed in May of 1971. And it took over the operation. They eliminated duplicate routes. They did all kinds of, their budget wasn't very big. And so we came up with what in the West became a very skeletal system that is not very unless you're going from a specific point to a specific point, was not very user-friendly. The Northeast Corridor, which we talked about before, was part of it. Amtrak was actually given ownership a few years later of that part of from Boston to Washington, essentially. And therefore, they own that part of it. But the rest of the system, for the most part, Amtrak continues to this day to operate on freight railroad tracks. And the deal that they made, the freight railroads made, was, okay, we'll give you the equipment. You'll operate the passenger railroad trains, but we'll agree to, you can operate over our tracks for a reduced cost, not the going market rate. And then secondly, we'll give you priority so that you're not sitting behind our freight trains and stuff like that. So this bargain and this situation which Amtrak was set up under was to relieve private enterprise from an operation that couldn't be operated profitably.
So to just explain, before this, private companies operated freight and passenger.
Right.
And in 1971, with this bill by Richard Nixon or whatever, it removed that burden from these private companies, so you could just do freight, and Amtrak is just going to do passenger.
Right.
Which like you said, I think it's why we have this. When you take the Amtrak today, it's like, why am I stopping in this like weird town? Like, why are these? It is a skeletal system. It's not what it used to be. It's kind of just. It's almost. I mean, I don't want to. It was kind of put on. Amtrak was almost like a form of life support for passenger rail.
Right. You hit that right. And the key thing is, John, at that point in time, we come around to the very first question, or what we talked about at the beginning. Why are people not aware? Well, when railroads operated passenger trains, they had to advertise. They did things like that. They were in the public market. Well, in the 50-plus years since Amtrak was founded, the railroads now, they don't have to appeal to the public. They just have to appeal to a cargo company or a freight company or some shipper of goods. And so they have almost become.
Why do they have to appeal to that?
They solicit business. Hey, listen, Ford, I'll haul your cars for you. But they don't appeal to the general public. They go to Ford, and they go just to their shippers, which are a very small number. They're not advertising on TV to say, hey, Ford, come ship your cars on our railroad.
And Amtrak doesn't have to do that because they're on life support with this bill.
Amtrak, it would behoove them to have a little more. It gets into an opinion. When you're not appealing to the mass market, you tend to get forgotten. And so it's an industry that we tend to forget about until we come to a railroad crossing and we're stuck for 25 minutes waiting for 3-mile-long freight trains to cross. In the United States today, there's basically 6 railroad companies. Once there used to be hundreds. They've merged, they've consolidated, some have gone bankrupt, out of business. We have 6 major railroad companies, and they're looking to, particularly in this last decade or two, they're looking to get with big shippers, and they want to make it as efficient and cheap as possible for them to haul things, but they don't have to appeal to the mass public. Now, Amtrak, in the 50 years, it's another story, a long, sad story, America has never fully embraced, and when I say America, I'm talking about the federal government. It's been this constant, it's never really fully embraced the concept of a national passenger rail system until a couple years ago, and I'll get to that real quick. But it has constantly been the subject of cutbacks, both Republican presidents, Democratic presidents. People have said, let's cut, it's not making money. We have this, we've evaluated our systems on are they making money or not. That becomes the report card. And I will tell you that virtually no passenger rail system in the world makes money. Now, certain trains and operations make money, and they can make money above board. When I say above board, they'll cover their fuel, they'll cover their, if there's fuel, they'll cover their electricity, they'll cover their train crew costs, things like that. But what they don't cover is the capital costs. The European rail systems are mostly all nationalized systems.
So they don't make money, even.
Yeah, and the infrastructure, they spend billions of dollars building and developing their systems that their people use. It's seen more, now they want efficiency, but they are seen more of a social service, like we need to provide this. And for example, the Chinese, since 2000, since 2000, they have built 26,000 miles of high-speed track, and they have spent $1.5 trillion building those lines that are capable of going up to 230 and 40 miles an hour. But now you can crisscross China to nearly every major city on a high-speed train set. And China is a big country, too. Not quite as big as the United States.
No, their mainland is a little. But their whole. I mean, to give people, it's the. If you include Alaska, we're bigger, but China's mainland is pretty approximate size to the U.S.
And you can go almost anywhere on a high-speed train there. And they even have overnight high-speed trains where you can go from from Hong Kong to Shanghai and all that, and on a high-speed train.
None of these, all these high-speed rails are a nationalized service that aren't meant to make money. They're meant to provide a service to the people.
They provide a service. Now, what they will they can cover their operating costs, but they will never fully cover their capital costs, because to build these high-speed lines.
And when you say capital costs, just operating costs operating costs are like except paying your passenger, maintaining equipment, and capital costs
employees, capital bridges, tunnels, the actual construction of the infrastructure, the track, and that type of thing.
So that's the capital.
Right.
It's not going to.
In this country, we've never really fully embraced what it costs or what it takes to run a passenger rail system, and so Amtrak has limped along for 50 plus years. And some routes, early years, they did add some stuff, and they've cut back over the years. And now we have this skeletal system, where Amtrak has grown is when states have taken interest. And there's been certain states that have invested a fair amount of dollars in improving the Amtrak trains within their state, or partner with Amtrak to run trains. So California has three main lines that they've really kind of invested in, which is like between LA and San Diego, and between San Jose and Sacramento, and between Oakland and Bakersfield, California. So, and Virginia, particularly these last 15 years, has gone gung-ho, realizing I-95 is at capacity. It's cheaper for us to add other means to try to move people. But Amtrak as a national system, except in the Northeast Corridor, where they've been a little bit better, but they still haven't made the gains that you would like to see, because Congress and the federal government hasn't jumped all in. The one exception was the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act in 2021. And that was signed by President Biden. And that provided Amtrak and the states had access to an unprecedented amount of capital to make improvements that they've never been able to make. It's buying new equipment. It's making major repairs to like the Northeast Corridor infrastructure, some of which is 200 years old. There's a tunnel in Baltimore that was built during the Civil War that Amtrak still uses as its main line. They need to rebuild that tunnel. It also is a slow point on the Northeast Corridor where you're supposed to be going fast. The speed limit's 30 miles an hour through the tunnel. So Amtrak is building a new tunnel next to it. It'll be 120 miles an hour. It'll be faster. It will.
So it's just not subject to the same regulations.
Well,
speed.
yeah, because the bricks aren't falling off the roof and things like that. And so we're not building. Well, there are a couple things, and maybe we can save that for another day. But we're not building anything new in the Northeast. We're rebuilding bridges. We're straightening some curves. We're doing incremental improvements, but we're not building a brand new high-speed railway like they did in France or China or places like that. And so, here's what's going to happen, and here's what's happening now in the politics of the current environment. Now, with a different administration, and they're withholding some of these funds that haven't been committed, and so therefore, some of the hoped for improvements and things like that are not.
They're subject to political changes.
Yes, the whims of back and forth.
Yeah.
And as opposed to, yes, this is an all-out commitment that in addition to a good highway system and in addition to a great, air system, we also need a rail system, particularly, and this is where high-speed rail and things like that, and it would work in the United States, particularly east of the Mississippi. In markets that are 200 to 400 miles long, high-speed rail is a winner. You can travel quicker by train than going to the airport, flying, and getting there. But without a true commitment.
So places would be like in the Texas Triangle.
Yes.
Or California's West Coast.
And that's a little further, and that is the line.
But between a place like, I don't know, LA and San Francisco, I mean, is that?
It's about 400 miles, and yes, that is one line that is actually under construction, but California has caught, in 2008, they passed a statewide initiative to allocate $8 billion to start construction of a high-speed line. They did that in anticipation. They thought the federal government was going to come up with a program to fund high-speed rail. Keep in mind, the interstate highway system is 90% or 80% federally funded and 10% or 20% by the states. So California was thinking, hey, if we put forth this effort, and maybe the federal government will come up with a high-speed program where they'll pay most of the costs, and the states, but it's never happened. And there's no match. And so California, except for a few influx of federal dollars, has had to do this project on its own. And I will tell you, the project has had a lot of problems. It has been it's behind schedule. The budget has gone much higher.
Lawsuits, eminent domain.
And that is what has led to a lot of the cost problems, lawsuits, things like that.
And this is where I wanted to kind of lead, where we started to wrap up, is where, so the idea of high-speed rail needs to be supported by everyday people. We're going to wrap up here. We got 10 minutes here. That was I wanted to emphasize the point you made about how in these places like China and Japan and Europe, high-speed rail is not a form to make money. It is more of a service. You need to have that backing by the government, but also I think that comes with a backing by a general support for the people. And I think today most people see in my generation, they see how this high-speed rail, it's been 15 years. They got 1.5 miles built. They're way over budget. High-speed rail is it's not worth the time, just based on this experience in California of taking so long. And I think a big point of it is it's not a money-making type of endeavor. It is a service endeavor to help people. It can provide a lot of value to getting people around in ways that I think, as more people get annoyed with traffic and stuff, I think this ideas around public transportation have to change in the American mind.
Right.
It's why I wanted to. I mean, it's easier in a place like Japan because they're homogeneous. There is much more unity in what they want to do, which definitely helps. I think I have a whole segment about homogeneity versus diversity and the trade-offs you have with each. But this is one where I think the idea of taking a train and being on a public service has to change in people's minds before they're willing to get behind it. It's why I wanted to have this conversation, to articulate that these trains, especially in places like, I remember when I was in Austin, Texas, the frickin' highway system was so, what is it, I-30 or I-20? I-15 there. It's
I-35, isn't it?
I think it's I-15.
No, 15's out in California. 30, it's either 35. I think it's 35.
Yeah, 30. It's I-35. Yeah. Oh my! It was 2 lanes, and that's way for a significant portion between San Antonio and Austin, and that's way for the amount of people that live in Austin now. It was, and as they try to do, I mean, they had construction there trying to figure out these different ways, and like you said, in those areas, like that would be great high-speed rail. You go to a place like Japan, and Japan. It's different because their culture also of timeliness is enforced there. But it's awesome. I think so many people, when they go there, they're like, oh my God, this is what public transportation could be. Yeah. So my question would be, is in your closing statement here, what people could do to kind of get involved, to maybe change their mind? What would be your pitch to try to sell the future of public transportation to people nowadays? Because I think you do have I want to compliment, your view is also very realistic. That's the thing I like talking to, is you're not this, evangelical, sometimes you get within other businesses where they're trying to sell you this thing that you feel like there's parts of it that, is he telling me the full truth? And I think you're being very upfront about the challenges, but also the benefits of this technology. So,
well, it's difficult. I mean, it's, how do you change? Well, here's what I think what needs to happen, and I think in this country, and I mean, there's pluses and minuses. I think Joe Biden provided the leadership to enable the bipartisan infrastructure.
Can I say one thing about that also too? I think that it also comes from the fact that, I mean, it was kind of a known fact, Joe Biden would take the Amtrak. I mean, he was personally invested.
Right. He was personally invested. And it was that kind of, I'm not saying plus or minus. What I'm saying is you finally had somebody in the position of the presidency who knew the value of it
and could provide, like you said, the leadership,
and could say, yes, we want to do this.
Okay,
that's what I'm saying. I'm not saying right, wrong. What I'm saying is you have the right person in the leadership
initiative.
Yeah, we need leadership. The other thing is, and this is what's plagued California, is we need to develop. We do not, and this is what we don't build big projects. We've struggled to build big projects in this country anymore because of environmental regulations that have gone amok and give everybody a chance.
Even though these trains probably help
Yes.
diminish in the
Yes.
long term,
Yes.
carbon emissions.
Right. And we also need to have the in-house ability, not relying on consultants, but organizations that can build things, that have the engineers, not train engineers, but civil engineers, electrical engineers, people who have the capability to do stuff. And what I would say for people is to, it's back to the same thing that has saved Amtrak from many times, is, you got to let your representatives know that this is important to you. Support initiatives on the local level that go on. And there's organizations called the Rail Passenger Association out of Washington, D.C. that have long advocated for passenger rail in this country. And just be supportive of it and say, hey, this is what I want as a priority to me. When you contact your elected officials, hey, this is important that we have this.
Maybe get an Amtrak ticket if
Yeah.
you're in that area.
Right.
It's really a lovely experience to especially in the West, like going from Salt Lake to Denver. I mean, it's a beautiful ride. It's very relaxing. It does take a little more time, but it can be. I remember when Evan and I would tell our friends, or they would come on the train, they may not say this is something I want to do every time due to some of the inefficiencies, but overall, I think a lot of people are really surprised at how enjoyable that experience can be.
Yes, and you know what I suggest? I mean, most of your listeners are Denver here, but hey, next winter, take the ski train. Just try the ski train.
Oh, that's
it's a cheap trip. I mean, it's not
no traffic waiting on I-25 or I-70.
This year they had record ridership on the ski train of 44,000 people.
It only is like an hour and a half.
It's about 2 hours, and yeah, give it a shot and see. This is what it can be. What can be done, and I would love to come back here and talk about some of the other things here.
I would love. This was so much fun. I mean, we didn't even get into other forms of public transportation like busing systems, and we didn't get to the local level. But I want to say this was so much fun. I think you are so knowledgeable about this, and I love your comprehensive view. Like and it's very nuanced. It's not this like preachy thing. The ins and outs and ups and downs of these systems, and this was so much fun, Dad. I'd love
enjoyed
to have
it
you
too,
back.
and I appreciated. It was fun to kind of write this stuff, make some notes and look into it. And then I realized one of my biggest challenges is how big this thing could get. And it's like, okay, we got to try.
I think we did a good job of covering the history. We'll go into other questions, but
and
thank you
what a
so
good time
much.
to do that. We were going to Japan, and so maybe after we go to Japan, we should come back and we should talk about the experience, and then what we can do from here.
Maybe we'll do
But also I appreciate the discussion. The format of as a discussion. I'm not just answering questions off a page.
I know. This was so much fun, Dad. Thank you. Happy Father's Day.
Thank you. I appreciate it.